What would you do to host a sports event? Would you compromise the health and well-being of athletes involved? Would you push a country into serious debt? Would you demolish the homes of 22,000 innocent families? The 2016 Olympics, being hosted in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, was one of the most unrealistic ideas in the country's history. One of the largest impacts on the Brazilian citizens during the planning and setting up of the 2016 Games was the housing crisis. In order to make room for expansions of the venue, along with enough road access for the huge crowds, the Brazilian government evicted 22,000 families, which is around 77,000 people, from their homes and demolished them. This finding has been reported by large news agencies such as the Huffington Post and the New York Times, and is unbelievably atrocious. 90% of the Polish population that lived in surrounding neighborhoods, including the roads leading up to the venue, were evicted, which left only 20 families with their homes. Most of these families were forced to move to favelas, which are essentially Brazilian slums in urban areas. This did not help with the already prevalent housing crisis in Rio de Janeiro. The city contains the largest population of people living in favelas in Brazil, leaving the slums overcrowded and in unethical living conditions. The Brazilian officials had made plans to upgrade the favelas, but the plans were scrapped before any developments were made. Even the idea of hosting one of the biggest and most celebrated sporting events of the modern age in a city that doesn't have the area for it seems almost laughable. But the Brazilian government was so set on the idea that they went to immoral and unfair lengths to do so. It's no secret that Brazil is currently facing one of the worst recessions in over 100 years. So it should have been obvious that providing the Olympics for the world and making such extensive changes to one of the cities to do so would be off the table economically. Despite the country plunging into an economical crisis due to the number of reasons, including political corruption and hosting the FIFA World Cup in 2014, they went through with the Olympics anyway. Because of the economic issues, the employment rate in Rio de Janeiro rose to 11%, while those who managed to keep their jobs were facing the wages plummeting vastly. The economy dropped by 5.4% in the first quarter of the year due to poor budgeting and wrongly prioritizing. Despite many of these facts being common knowledge to those who pay attention to current events and the economic climate, it is generally ignored and masked over by the excitement towards the Olympics itself. Surely, being familiar with these shocking statistics would be enough to cancel the event and relocate to a more financially stable and less corrupt country. However, it was decided that Brazil would rather deal with the effects of the event for years and even decades after and go ahead with it anyway. Not only did the city's state impact the locals, but it had harsh health effects on the athletes competing. While most of the locations for the events were up to standard, there was one concern: Guanabara Bay. In order to host water events such as sailing, officials promised to get rid of 80% of raw sewage that polluted the waterways so that the bay would be able to be used. This seemed a fairly difficult pledge to deliver, which proved to be the case, as in 2015 the bay's water was analysed and it was found that it was still riddled with disease-causing viruses directly linked to human sewage, at levels of up to 1.7 million times, what would be considered highly alarming in the US or Europe. This rather disgusting finding, along with every other alarming aspect, was still not enough to cancel, or at least postpone the Games, and even the bay itself. There was one more hiccup when the athletes who completed the trial run of their event fell ill, some of them even contracting MRSA infections as a result of the disgusting state of the water. Even after the government selfishly continued the Olympic Games despite the horrific impacts on the citizens of the country, putting the athletes' lives at risk, was not enough to cancel the Games or even the water events. Due to these appalling crises, and even many other social or political issues, it is entirely ridiculous that the Olympics were held in such a corrupt country that did not have the sufficient funds or space or even state of health. This case should never be repeated, as it put such a vast amount of lives at risk. Rio de Janeiro hosting the 2016 Summer Olympic Games was an illogical and moronic idea. So after hearing this, tell me, what would you do to host a sporting event? Thank you for listening to my speech.